Hello and welcome everyone. Going to give it a minute for everyone to come in. I know it's 12 noon because I can hear the test sirens outside. I don't know if everybody else is hearing that. But welcome, welcome. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as I welcome everyone to our September webinar. So, thank you for coming, everybody. We are so happy to be back on the horse for our webinar series with 1,000 Friends. Our September topic is called Make Way for Pedestrians, Take Steps to Advocate for Safe Streets in Your Community. And as you can see, we do love a good play on words. So we're very proud of ourselves for this title. We are going to hear from Denise Jess from the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired, and Cassie Steiner-Bouxa from the Wisconsin chapter of the Sierra Club, all about advocating for safe streets and best practices for good engineering for streets, for pedestrian safety. I've got a few reminders before we get started. Please turn off your camera and mute your mic to minimize distraction. We do have closed captioning available. You can enable that. I think there's a CC button at the bottom of your screen if that is something that you need. Because we do have people on this call using screen readers, please refrain from posting to the chat during the presentation because that triggers the screen readers and that can be an extra chatter and distraction for people using them. We will, however, open up the chat for Q&A after presentation. So if you have a question that you want to post in the chat, just write it down or hold it in your head until the end, and we'll be sure to get to it. And finally, as you've probably noticed, we are recording this webinar, so we will make it available with links to everything we talk about later today or tomorrow, and that will be sent out to everybody who registered. So don't worry about saving links or trying to remember all of that stuff. So again, welcome on behalf of 1,000 Friends of Wisconsin. I just want to introduce our organization here. We were founded in 1996 as a land use planning nonprofit organization. So for the last 25 years, we have been working with communities all around the state to promote good land use, environmental stewardship, transportation equity, healthy communities all around the state. We run a program called Active Wisconsin that we took over in 2020. That is a coalition of communities and advocacy groups from all over Wisconsin who are dedicated to specifically active transportation infrastructure. So our purpose is to try to make it better for anyone to walk or bike or take transit, regardless of their income, race, gender, ability. And we do that by sharing resources and providing technical assistance and advocating at the state level for funding and for good policy. If you want to see what we're up to, you can follow us on social media. Our handles are there at the bottom of the screen. We're active on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. We also have a monthly e-news with all the latest information, and to sign up, you can visit our website, either at 1kfriends.org or activewisconsin.org. That is really the best way to find out what we're doing. I do have a few items of news and updates to share. First, I want to brag on Greg May, our Transportation Policy Director, for a little bit. He's been working really hard with this coalition based in Milwaukee, urging the Department of Transportation to rethink 794. They have a proposal to rebuild the interchange on the lake, and there are a whole lot of groups who are urging the DOT to think of alternatives, namely to take down the interchange and replace it with a street grid That would be much better for the economy and the communities there. There was just an article posted yesterday quoting Greg extensively that we'll make sure to send out in the links after. But the DOT is starting to consider alternatives. So this is definitely a big step in the right direction. As far as my work with Active Wisconsin, I have been working with a grant from COWS in collaboration with 3 cities that are part of our Green Tier Legacy Communities Network to develop safer routes to schools and parks for children and families. I have some highlights on our website and that have been coming out in the e-news, but essentially that is a project to improve health and equity by making sure that people can get to popular parks and school sites safely by walking and biking if they so choose. Finally, there are a couple of conferences this fall that we are very excited to be a part of. The Healthy Communities Summit is at the end of September in Madison at the Concourse Hotel. That is put on by the Wisconsin Bike Fed and the Office of Outdoor Recreation. So it's 2 days full of keynote speeches and panel discussion, all about healthy communities, sustainability, outdoor recreation. I am speaking on one of the panels, and that is going to be appealing to anybody who has a business related to outdoor recreation, who is part of an effort for healthy communities, for anybody who's a bike enthusiast or just really cares about better outdoor recreation and infrastructure. Then in October, the Climate Fast Forward Conference, we're very proud to be co-sponsoring that. Greg May is speaking in one of the panels for that. That is at the Monona Terrace and is being put on by the Wisconsin Academy of the Arts and Sciences. So we'll have links to all of this stuff, including highlights and registration for conferences in the communication that goes out after this webinar. This webinar is possible in part because of the Coalition for More Responsible Transportation. 2 of the groups in that coalition are the Council of the Blind and Sierra Club. There are more than 24 organizations representing localities and also statewide, whose main mission is to promote responsible use of taxpayer money on better transportation options than just highway expansion. Things like safe networks for bikers and pedestrians and better transit options. I think you're probably seeing a theme here in all of my introductory stuff. 2 things that the coalition has been responsible for in the last year is the Fix at 6 report that was released a year ago. That was proposing an alternative to highway expansion in Milwaukee, urging the DOT to keep the, I believe it was I-94 at 6 lanes instead of making it wider, and expanding transit options and improving street design there on the grid. And also back in February, CMRT worked to organize Transit Equity Day on the 4th of February, which is Rosa Parks' birthday. So that brought more awareness to equity issues within transit systems and led to a lot of municipalities making declarations and just in general creating more of a buzz around the importance of equity in transit. So now this brings me to the topic for today, which is Make Way for Pedestrians. So in case you're wondering why we are so focused on this topic right now, there are a bunch of reasons. First, October is Pedestrian Safety Month. So we really wanted to host this webinar a few weeks ahead of time so that people can prepare and be aware of the different things they can do for their communities to improve pedestrian safety. It's important because safe streets really should be everybody, for everybody. Inclusivity is important. Streets that are designed to be safe and usable for people who are disabled or who have particular mobility challenges, turns out they're better and safer for everybody. So this is really to benefit everyone. This is an important equity issue. 30% of people in Wisconsin, of the entire Wisconsin population, are non-drivers. This includes children under 16. This includes people who are disabled and cannot drive. This includes people who are low income and cannot afford to drive. This is people includes people who are elderly and cannot drive. So this impacts a wide swath of people all over the state. And in addition to that, people who are further marginalized by race or income or ability are more likely to be in that non-driving population. So if we make our streets safer for everyone, we are really uplifting everyone. In addition to that, we know that nationwide, injuries and deaths from traffic crashes that impact pedestrians have been rising since the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. This is true across the nation. It is true in Wisconsin, and it has caught national attention. For example, the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, has been bringing attention to this, and there is actually money in the bipartisan infrastructure bill from last year that goes directly to communities to improve street design. So this is a growing issue that more people are aware of, and that we need advocacy around to improve that infrastructure in our communities. Finally, better pedestrian safety is good for sustainability. If it is easier to replace short car trips with walking, people will do that. That means fewer car trips, which means less air pollution, which means cleaner air for us, and fewer greenhouse gas emissions that are warming the planet. So I hope I've convinced you. And next, I will introduce our speakers. We are first going to hear from Denise Jess. She is the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired. She advocates for the rights of Wisconsin's nearly 2 million non-drivers. That's that 30% I just mentioned. Denise herself is legally blind and knows firsthand these everyday challenges that many people face when they cannot or choose not to drive. And as you can see, she serves on quite a number of committees and advisory councils specifically advocating for disability rights and access for people who are disabled. Our second speaker is Cassie Steiner-Bouxa from the Wisconsin chapter of the Sierra Club. They are the senior campaign coordinator. They staff volunteer teams, work on equitable transportation and other campaigns related to reducing carbon emissions. Cassie supports volunteers and members of the public in making decisions and organizing around grassroots efforts. And they're just all around a really knowledgeable, wonderful person who knows a ton about advocacy and working within your community to make it better. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Denise. Remember that if you have questions that come up during the presentation, save it for the end, and we'll make sure we give you an opportunity to post them in the chat. So take it away, Denise.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Susan, for that excellent introduction. So I am Denise Jess with the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired. This webinar has been a twinkle in our eyes collectively for several months. So it's really exciting to have it come to fruition today and to have such an excellent number of participants from a variety of places and organizations within the state of Wisconsin. So I love intersectionality. It is so vital that we have people with a variety of perspectives across the disability advocacy sector, the older adults sector, from BIPOC communities and environmental communities, because creating more equitable, accessible, both transportation networks and pedestrian infrastructure really benefits so many of us, and it is what helps move our communities forward to greater equity. So I love the diversity of partners that are here today. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I want to begin with sharing a little bit about the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired. For those of you who are not familiar with our work, I'm happy to introduce ourselves to you today. We are celebrating our 70th anniversary this year. We were founded in 1952 by people with blindness and vision impairment who saw the importance of coming together under one umbrella to advocate for the needs of people living with vision loss. And since that time, our advocacy mission has remained very strong and very vital. These days, our primary advocacy focus is on transportation and pedestrian safety, because among that 30% of people who are non-drivers in the state of Wisconsin, people with vision impairment, are nearly exclusively non-drivers. Education access, employment access are also key. 70% of our population experiences unemployment, often due to lack of access technology and employer bias that really prohibit us from engaging fully in the workforce. And then healthcare, long-term care, and voting rights is something that it takes up a lot of our advocacy time, because with the increasing threats to the right to vote and voter suppression, we are working hard to continually remove those barriers. Additionally, our mission includes providing education, both to folks who are losing sight. There are certainly folks in the state who are like me, who have experienced vision loss for all or most of our lives, but the greatest number of folks experiencing vision loss are adults, particularly working age and older adults who are losing sight from eye diseases like macular degeneration, retinopathy from diabetes, and glaucoma. So in a lot of ways, vision loss will touch, if not all of us, many of us as people lose sight in their elder years. So getting connected with us if you have a family member, if you yourself are someone with vision loss, please reach out, because another part of the work that we do is to provide vision services, including access to free white canes, which I'll talk about again in a little while. So our mission is really focused on promoting the dignity and the empowerment of people living with vision loss through doing both that systems change work and the in the individual learning skills work. And our guiding values are inclusivity, integrity, and uncompromising respect. And we can go to the next slide. So pedestrian safety is so incredibly important. Susan's overview of why it matters was very powerful, and there's just a couple things that I really want to highlight. Of course, safety, really reducing deaths and significant injury to pedestrians and drivers too. They can incur issues, but really a pedestrian who is hit by a vehicle going 40 miles an hour or higher is pretty much assured either death or life-changing injury. For those of us with vision loss, crossing streets is, in all seriousness, the most dangerous activity that we do multiple times a day. As I walk to work in the morning, I carefully plan out my route, knowing the traffic patterns, the changes in traffic patterns with construction. Sometimes I walk out of my way to use signalized intersections, and the whole trip is spent on planning for safe street crossing and doing as much as I am able to do to manage those street crossings safely. But I am very dependent on how the road is constructed and driver behavior for my safety. Access is key, for folks that are pedestrians, whether by choice or by necessity. We need to be able to get to employment, healthcare services, community services, and just to be able to spend time with family and friends and reduce loneliness. Many folks that I know, myself included, have had to decline employment because there was either not public transportation available or not walkable, or the combination thereof. And for overall well-being, this really matters, reducing loneliness and isolation, which are key challenges to people with disabilities, experience loneliness and isolation at much higher rates than our non-disabled peers. And we can move forward. So what I'm excited to do with you today is share with you the street features that I really consider game changers in creating greater accessibility. And I want to be concrete and specific because these are the very sorts of things that you can advocate for in your communities. Because just saying something like we want to see complete streets or walkable communities, that's awesome. And I'm, 100% on board with that. But our decision makers need our wise guidance. So what would be the features that are really going to support walkable communities and connected networks? So I'll start with accessible pedestrian signals. And basically, these are talking street crossing signals. And they come in a couple of different forms. The one that's right outside of our office in Madison at the corner of Williamson Street in Livingston is at a non-signalized intersection. So there's not a stop and go light there. But we recognized that this was an important crossing and it needed some guidance. So this one is a flashing beacon. And when the button is pressed, the signal says the walk light is on to cross, and it does it both in English and in Spanish. Pedestrian, this one is pedestrian controlled, which means that when I need it, I push the button, the beacon flashes, and I get the audio warning. It's not a signal though, so I still have to be very attentive to what cars are doing. Most people have been now well trained and responsive to stopping, but other folks either don't see the flashing beacon or don't realize that it actually means please stop. So it still requires quite a bit of attentiveness. There is both that audio and tactile connection that when I press the button, I get a little bit of vibration, which tells me that I have successfully pressed the button in addition to getting the audio signal. And the signs and the flashing beacons are really meant to grab the attention of drivers. And this one is placed over the street so that it's not on the side, and it really is much more visible to drivers. And we can go to the next slide. The impact of these, and this comes from Bruce, who is a resident of Two Rivers, where there is also accessible pedestrian signals, is that he can tell when it's time to cross and when it's okay to cross based on getting the voice and having that voice give information. It never says it's safe to cross because drivers are drivers and they may or may not stop, but it tells you that the walk light is on or that the signal is flashing. And for those of us with vision impairment, one of the things that we're always doing when we're crossing streets is we're listening for the traffic pattern. And so we're paying attention, is the traffic parallel to me right now, or is it perpendicular to me? If it's perpendicular to me, I can't cross. If it's parallel to me, I'm assuming it's safe to cross. But these accessible PED signals help reduce the stress of also paying attention to parallel traffic. We can go forward. The accessible PED signals, so some considerations for them, just a couple things to know. They can also be at signalized intersections. So there are ones that will tell you the street name, and then when the walk light is on, and then it will tell you to wait when it's unsafe to cross. Those also have a tactile buzz to them, so you can feel that when you press the button. Also very helpful. The street name is incredibly helpful for orientation, so I know exactly where I am. I was in Cedarburg visiting pre-pandemic, and I was so excited when I heard that there was an accessible signal there, and it told me what street I was on. You know, a signal is on to cross Washington Avenue. And so not only was it helpful for the street crossing, but it was incredibly helpful to know exactly where I was. So some considerations, you know, when you are helping to guide the installation of these is mounting the pedestal and making sure that the pedestal that this is on is the same diameter as the pole so that it is accessible for wheelchair users. If the pedestal sticks out really far, someone may not be able to reach past the pedestal to hit the button. So being really mindful of that. That using tactile information to give you a sense of where the buttons are to push. This one is raised, so it's really easy to tell. And then having a locator beacon. So this one goes beep, 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 so that as I'm approaching it, I hear exactly where the signal is and it helps me locate the button. Couple of things to know that these are funded through the federal government. So while the decision about placement is made at the local level, the funding comes from the feds, and it is a funding cycle. So if you put a request in for one of these and it's approved, but you're at the end of the funding cycle or the funding is gone for that year, you'll need to wait until the next funding cycle to get them. The money does not magically appear. And that's what happened for us. We had an approval and then we needed to wait several months before installation happened. To have a best sense of where these are going to really make a difference, I highly recommend partnering with the folks in your community with vision loss, because we know full well which streets in the community are most hazardous to cross and which ones we need to cross in order to get to vital services. And we can go forward. Curb ramps are another feature that make all the difference, another game changer for multiple groups of people. So, oh, and I was going to mention too, with the accessible PED signal, I cannot tell you how many neighbors who do not have any form of disability have seen me in the community and thanked me for that accessible PED signal, because it just makes life easier for passage on a very busy arterial street for everybody. So curb ramps are another benefit to all. They are giving that slope from sidewalk down into street. When they're done well, the ramp itself, it has high contrast, and the image that is on the screen shows that the curb ramp is a reddish rust color, I think. And so it stands out from the sidewalk. So folks with functional vision are able to see where the curb ramp is. It also is tactile. It has what are called truncated bumps or a tactile warning field. And for those of us who get a ton of information from our feet, those bumps are really, really critical because they cue me, along with the feel of the slope, that I'm about to exit the sidewalk and move into the street. They should be aligned with the crosswalk. So you can, those of you who can see this image, and I'll describe it, the curb ramp is beautifully lined up with the white lines for the crosswalk. They really need to be on all corners. And this is a really important advocacy piece because municipalities will try to do some scrimping on the budget by putting curb ramps halfway between the two corners of the intersection. And because it's cheaper to put in one than it is to put in two. Putting in one at that halfway point, you can totally imagine the problems with that. It puts the pedestrian right out into the intersection and really puts the pedestrian at significant risk. Even moving to the curb ramp, you have to go into the flow of traffic if you're pushing a stroller, using a bicycle, or using a wheelchair. So your advocacy to make sure that there's one of these on each corner is really critical. The other thing that they do is they reduce ankle injuries because you're not stepping off a curb without seeing where the curb edge is. And a hidden benefit that I've been discovering is that with that contrast pavement, they actually, the snow melt happens faster because that darker pavement attracts the sun, and it just makes street crossing that much easier. We can go forward. So colored pavement is another street feature that is a game changer in my world. And again, easier to see for those of us with some functional vision, but also super helpful for drivers and all users. The image that is shown here is of green pavement and multiple curb ramps going off the sidewalk, because this is a bicycle crossing. So in the city of Madison, and I don't know if this is universal to all municipalities, bike paths are green, and pedestrian crossings often are kind of a reddish color. And so super helpful to me as a pedestrian who's visually impaired, because I want to do my best to stay out of bike traffic as well, because a bike pedestrian injury can also be problematic and result in, in injury. So that colored pavement, super helpful. We can go forward. To drivers, some of the things that we hear about the impact is that some drivers love that colored pavement because it keeps them more alert. Things are changing in the environment, and it's giving cues about who is where when we have multiple users in the street area. Things like continental crosswalks are also another thing that is excellent to advocate for. And if you aren't familiar with a continental crosswalk, it's like on the two parallel lines of the crosswalk, then there are perpendicular lines. So it almost looks like a ladder. Those really stand out to drivers in a much more distinct way than the simple two white lines to mark the crosswalk. So paint is cheap. And so if there are things that can be accomplished through paint and cement, but paint in particular, highly encourage your advocacy to look at how paint might help create greater accessibility. And we can move forward. Pretty amazing. They were new to me probably about 7-8 years ago, and I have become a big fan of them. It's where the sidewalk at the intersection extends further out into the roadway. And so it decreases the amount of time that the pedestrian is actively in the roadway because the distance is shorter. So these are, they're fantastic because drivers also can see pedestrians better because we're sticking out, so to speak, kind of past where parked cars are, but yet we're still on a pedestrian refuge of being on the sidewalk. If you are advocating for these, one of the places to know where you're going to get some pushback is from your public works folks, because they are kind of a pain to navigate when snow plowing. If the snowplow driver isn't aware of where the bump out is, they can do some curb damage. So, plan for that and be prepared to mitigate it. I'm really talking about the advantages of having the bump outs. And this image also has a great example of a continental crosswalk. And we can go forward. Roundabouts. Yikes. So I didn't write yikes on the slide, but that's how I feel about them. Roundabouts are they're a very popular and ever-growing popular feature for moving traffic without having to signalize intersections. And this is my bias, I will completely own it. They really are about moving cars. And in a car-centric world, roundabouts are I can see the efficiency of them, but they disturb me greatly because they're very tough to navigate for pedestrians. They're unsignalized, and they're difficult to predict the traffic patterns. Even though there is a traffic pattern in a roundabout, many drivers are not familiar with them. So, they're changing lanes and trying to figure out how they navigate. And so that concept of listening to parallel traffic that I described earlier is completely blown out of the water when you're interacting with a roundabout. I can listen to my heart's content, but I can't really fully tell where the cars are coming, which way they're moving. And so I often, if I encounter a roundabout, really have to stand there a long time until I'm pretty sure there's no cars coming, which is also confusing to drivers, wondering when the woman with the cane is ever going to cross. So when possible, I would highly recommend advocating for the use of these only in areas where pedestrians are not typically going to be found. Like sometimes they are useful when you're coming off a highway and you're still way out from the interior of the community. Working on the City of Madison's Traffic or Transportation Commission, we saw a place where we could do a win-win, where we put in a roundabout, but instead of having 4 legs, it only had 3, and the sidewalk stayed on the side of the roundabout that did not have any legs. And so we were able to accomplish the traffic moving and at the same time preserve pedestrian safety. All right, we can go forward. Sidewalks, oh, they're so critical. So, and they're controversial. So I'll talk about both of those things. So the benefit of sidewalk is it reduces pedestrian and car incidences up to 50%. So that's pretty compelling in my world. It connects people in places, and they are needed, and they're really needed on both sides of the street. Now, I realize that statement is potentially where some people are taking a deep breath because it is more pavement. And so I want to fully acknowledge the payment issues and the heating issues that come with pavement. The benefit of on both sides of the street is that if the sidewalk on only one side, and the place that I need to get to that doesn't have sidewalk is mid-block. Now I'm faced with a difficult decision. Do I walk to the intersection and use the crosswalk, but then have to walk potentially in the shoulder or on the grass, which might be unstable, to get to my destination, or do I try to cross mid-block? So it puts me as a pedestrian in a pretty precarious spot. I recognize the issue to trees, and so really working with your forestry department to find a way to do sidewalk installation that also does as least as possible disruption to roots, and then also doing the advocacy work on sidewalk salt usage and alternatives to that for land for property owners, so that we're not filling our environment and our sewer system water system with salt. There are semi-permeable pavement alternatives, and they are ADA compliant so that they are smooth enough for a wheelchair to pass easily, but then there can also be some permeability to reduce runoff. And we can go forward. Some other things about sidewalks is that it's really important to have the pavement be even. And so if you are not someone with a disability, not someone who's elderly, but you notice uneven pavement, tree roots are pushing things up, or poor sidewalk maintenance, and there's a lot of cracks. This is a great advocacy opportunity because that uneven pavement becomes a tripping hazard, and it also becomes a way for wheelchairs to get stuck. It just becomes a mobility nightmare. A good separation between the sidewalk and the roadway is also very helpful. And by the Americans with Disabilities standard, sidewalk width needs to be at least 4 foot wide whenever possible. And we can go forward. Is a nightmare. Again, I don't say that on the slide, but I'm adding my editorial. I think it's rough for everybody, whether it's street construction, sidewalk construction, or building construction. For vulnerable populations like people with disabilities, elders, and children, construction is not only an inconvenience, it can be incredibly dangerous. The image that's here shows a sidewalk out. It's raw dirt, a lot lot of it rutted, very difficult to almost impossible to navigate safely. And so how do we navigate this nightmare if we can't see, if we use a wheelchair, or if we are elderly? And we can go forward. So there are really good best practices for sidewalk construction or any kind of construction management, and the barricades that are shown in this image, which run along the construction site, are really, I think, an outstanding example. Those barricades are really critical and up in advance warning so that people know if sidewalks or areas are dangerous. I was doing a street crossing on the UW campus earlier this spring, and there's significant construction at a very complex intersection, and there was no barrier on the side where the sidewalk was still open, but as soon as you cross the street, it was sidewalk closed. So there was no forewarning. I don't have enough vision to see across multiple lanes, and all the pavement or all the barricades were white, so everything blended together. So I happily hit the walk button, got the auditory signal that the light was on to cross, and walked across, and my cane hit the barricade. No sidewalk, and I was essentially trapped between an orange construction barrel and the barricade while I waited for the light cycle to change, and 5 lanes of traffic or 4 lanes of traffic were whizzing past me. It was utterly terrifying. Thank goodness someone saw me, called 911. And then when the light cycle changed, a young woman came into the intersection when it was safe and helped me get back across the street. Then I called the city, and the proper barricades were put up so that it would prevent the crossing of anyone else. Thankfully, in the city of Madison, we have a statutory ordinance that things are required to be properly marked during construction to avoid situations like that. And the construction company incurred a fine. So that's an advocacy issue that you can work on. If you are moving along in your community and you see that there are no barriers, please let your leaders know so that barriers can be put up to avoid a situation that I experienced. I'm happy to be here to tell you about it. And you can also advocate for that kind of construction guideline that proper barriers have to be put up, or there's a penalty for the construction company. And we can move forward. And here's some more examples of really good sidewalk preservation during construction. So this one has kind of a temporary surface on it. Often those are done with rubber mats, almost like winter, messy boot mats. And they're useful because they provide firm footing, and they also are wheelchair accessible. So if there's construction going on in your neighborhood or in the places where you work or pass and you don't see these kinds of features, this is a great advocacy action to make them more accessible during that time of transition. And we can go forward, and I'm monitoring time, Cassie. So signage, super important. I think it's obvious, to really make sure that it's placed with enough advance warning for people to be able to utilize it, and we'll go forward. And just in closing, this is really everybody's responsibility together. So engaging our planners and our designers. I not too long ago heard a municipal planner say, wow, I've never thought about these issues in this way. Well, for non-drivers and pedestrian, and our commissioners don't either, because they drive to our meetings in their cars. And so really engaging our planners and our designers in this conversation is really vital. Consistent driver education, super important. And those of us who are pedestrians need to follow our rules of the road as well. And also for those of us with vision impairment, get the proper training from an orientation and mobility specialist to be able to navigate safely. And then my last slide. So here's some more advocacy things to be thinking about. Pedestrian safety features, like we've talked about today, driver awareness, and building in things that increase attentiveness. advocating for mass and micro transit so that we have connected systems and connected bike systems as well. Even though I'm not a biker, I know that having a good bike network helps me because it helps build in features that are going to help everyone. And then prompt snow removal. I stuck that one in as we head to winter because poor snow removal is a absolute nightmare for those of us who are trying to navigate. So you can be a great advocate by both shoveling your own snow, but also advocating for proper snow removal. And we can go forward. So here is contact information for the council. And if you don't want to have to hurriedly write this down, our phone numbers and our web address at info@wcblind.org. We can include it in the follow-up, and we'll save questions for me till the end because I really want to hand it over to Cassie because I'm so excited for her to talk with you about some advocacy opportunities, how the system works and how you can influence it. And Molly, I heard your question. So let's see if Cassie helps to answer it. And there's our handles. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Denise. And also Molly for your question in the chat about advocacy opportunities. That's exactly where we're going next. So segue. So yes, I'm Cassie Steiner. I'm with the Sierra Club Wisconsin chapter. And going to walk through a couple of ways to apply what Denise just talked about in your advocacy. So first, really quick about Sierra Club. Our mission is to explore, enjoy, and protect the wild places of the earth. And we are the statewide branch here in Wisconsin with around 20,000 members, about 1,000 active volunteers, and even more supporters. And so, and from all across the state. So I will give some examples from Madison, but I've also picked some smaller municipalities to give some variety of examples. Sierra Club works on a handful of different priority issues: beyond coal to clean energy, beyond oil, protecting wildlife and public lands, blocking destructive mining, protecting water quality and quantity, and clean and accessible transportation, which is where this is fitting into our work. So the first step in advocating for making some of these improvements is to first notice the gaps and the needs around you. So Denise walked through several really big game changers in infrastructure, and looking at your surroundings and seeing where these features are and where they are not is a really essential place to begin. Another great resource for this is AARP's Walk Audit Toolkit. So this is a toolkit that walks through how you can audit the pedestrian infrastructure in your area and identify where some of these needs are. The toolkit walks through making a map, identifying who uses the street, identifying what the sidewalks and crossings are like, different transit access, and then snow removal, as Denise mentioned as well. So there are many tools in that toolkit. Again, links will be sent out after this, but paired with the information Denise shared, this is a really great tool to identify some low-hanging fruit that can really make a difference in your municipality. After you know some of the key infrastructure pieces that you want to see changed or improved, you should identify opportunities to give that input. Sometimes this is using an opportunity that's already built in, and I'll talk about what those look like. Sometimes though, this is you needing to bring it up to decision makers. So there were a lot of good examples, like the pedestrian signalized crossing on Williamson Street that Denise mentioned. being something that was identified by the council as a key piece of infrastructure that should be added. So there are opportunities for you to raise this with your local elected officials and decision makers, but also to submit some of this feedback when there are open comment periods. So to identify who you go to, and this gets to the root of the question in the chat, if you're looking locally, and a lot of these infrastructure pieces are decided at the local level, you can look at your municipality or county website. For some of the smaller municipalities in the state, they don't have websites. They're all sort of within the county website. So you might have to look at your city or your township or your county to identify. And then you can look through to see what committees might be making decisions about pedestrian infrastructure. In bigger cities like Madison, Milwaukee, La Crosse, there are going to be transportation committees that are specific to addressing transportation needs. Sometimes there are pedestrian and bike committees. Sometimes though, these decisions fall under a much broader public works committee. So it's worth thinking creatively about where these decisions might be made, and then using that information to contact members of the committee to talk about what opportunities for feedback exist. So is there an open comment period? What does planning for the area look like? If there's not any open comment period and you have something that you want to see changed, how can you work with the committee to make that happen? So this is a screen grab from the City of Madison's website. And so I just Googled Transportation Committee, Madison, Wisconsin, and was able to pull up this webpage, and it talks about the current initiatives that some of the transportation committees are working on. And each of those links will have more information about the processes, public comment opportunities, public hearings, public meetings. So this is a simple way in bigger cities to identify what opportunities already exist. On the flip side, if you want to go to the next slide, this is from Calumet County. I picked this sort of arbitrarily. My grandparents' farm is in Calumet County. So I looked up Chilton, Wisconsin transportation, didn't find much there, but I did find on the Calumet County website a list of the various committees. And so when I'm looking at this list of committees, some of the ones that might be relevant are the Aging and Disability Resource Center, the Planning and Zoning Committee, even sometimes water conservation might overlap with some features on the street. And so those are some of the committees, if I were in Calumet County, that I might go to first. And then next slide. And if I got stuck, I would ask my city clerk, if you have one, or your city council person or county board representative should be able to help you find who is making decisions about pedestrian infrastructure at the local level. It might take a little bit of poking around, but I've found that if you ask the people who are elected to represent you, usually they can help you find who to go to bring up the issues that you're concerned about. The other big opportunity is at the state level. So the Wisconsin state budget is a process that's about to begin later this year. And this is an opportunity to show the governor, the lieutenant governor, Department of Transportation, and the legislature that pedestrian safety is a top priority and should be well funded, including grant programs that can help municipalities invest in some of these solutions. The graphic on the right is comes from the treasurer's office. It's a roadmap of how the budget process works. So at the start, the state agencies create their budgets, they send those to the governor, and then the governor develops the budget first draft. The Joint Finance Committee then reads it, schedules public hearings around the state, takes input. The legislature go back and forth and hopefully find some sort of compromise, and then pass the budget, in which the governor can sign it all, veto it all, or line item veto. So approve most of it, but veto some pieces of it. The agencies should be starting requests late this fall and into winter. And so this is when this process will kick off. And I know that this is something that CMRT has watched pretty closely and been very active in engaging with. So there are a few advocacy practices that are helpful to have in your toolbox. These are just a few. I think you can be really creative with this. And we'll dig into each of these. Greg, next slide. So the first opportunity that I've mentioned a couple of times is making testimony or written comments. This is if there's already some sort of input process created. So a couple of steps for preparing testimony or written comment would be to introduce yourself, where you're from, so that the decision maker knows that you're in the area that you're talking about. Thank them for the public input opportunity. Share your position. So, I'm here because I want to make sure that the new intersection includes bump outs, right? Tell your story or make your statement. Denise's story that she told is a really powerful example of how your story can really underscore why this infrastructure is important and why these decisions need to be made. And then you can conclude with your main points, again, your ask. This is just a very general way to shape comments or testimony that you're giving. And then organizing others is a really key part of this as well. So especially for local changes, I have found that especially in small municipalities, even just a couple people coming to the committee with a concern can make the difference. Some of these committees don't hear from constituents very regularly. And so hearing from 3 or 4 people all asking for the same signalized pedestrian crossing can make the difference in some of these cases. So some of the opportunities to collaborate with others are to invite others to do a walk audit with you, to attend a public hearing or submit a written comment, to write a letter to the editor to your local paper, or to call or meet with a decision maker with you. For some people who aren't in the advocacy realm, these can feel like big first steps. So doing it with others who have done this before is a really great way to make it more comfortable for people to advocate. And then meeting with decision makers is another piece that I missed, or that I mentioned. The toolkit that Sierra Club has is linked, and so you'll get the link in the follow-up. But you can also plan meetings with decision makers, especially if there's not a public comment period open, being able to meet with the committee and say, how can we find a solution to this intersection? Something needs to change. It's unsafe. This is what we're asking for. How can we make it happen? And really working with decision makers to achieve that. And then again, you can leverage press. I linked another resource for you. If you've never written a letter to the editor before, that's a great way to get public attention and to educate others on the importance of pedestrian safety. There are a few current opportunities, which is why we are talking about this right now in September. So October is Pedestrian Safety Month, and October 15th is White Cane Safety Day. The council does a great amount of organizing around White Cane Safety Day, educating the public and decision makers, and also asking for mayors or city council members to issue proclamations about White Cane Safety Day, again, to educate committee members, decision makers, and the public about the White Cane Safety Law, which is that drivers must stop 10 feet or more from a pedestrian with a white cane or a service dog. So next steps coming out of this webinar, you can use that toolkit that, again, you'll get the link to ask your mayor or your city council to proclaim October 15th as White Cane Safety Day. And another next step would be to use that AARP walk audit toolkit in your municipality to pair that with the best practices that Denise shared to identify pedestrian improvements that you want to advocate for locally. And then I have my contact information here, and we can move into Q&A.
Thank you so much, both Denise and Cassie. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I do realize that it is 1 o'clock. We still have a bunch of people on, so we'll stick around to answer some questions. So let's do that. If you have questions, now is a great time to put them in the chat. We also have some folks monitoring the Facebook link. So if you have a question, please put the text in the chat and we'll make sure it gets answered. I do see a hand up, so I guess Ryan.
Yeah, I had a question for Denise regarding the curb ramps. I'm actually an engineer and have to design those often. And I would love to get your feedback. The diagonal ramps directly into the intersection, I'm 100% with you. Those are bad. We avoid those at all costs.
Thank you.
But sometimes due to constraints outside of my control, the two perpendicular ramps are very close to one another, very close to the corner. And it is often my intent to keep those ramps and tactile feedback in line with the overall sidewalk to the greatest degree possible. What is your thought on a crosswalk that is set back from the intersection in such a way that good perpendicular ramps can be provided at a short distance, but they are not necessarily in line with the sidewalk?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ryan. Thank you. And I'm imagining with the, yeah, I've got what you're talking about. I think, you know, that making sure that the person's lined up to cross the correct direction makes a lot of sense. So if it's confusing, which curb ramp am I on, you know, reducing that confusion. So moving it back as you're describing it. And then I think having some kind of demarcation for traffic to give ample distance, particularly to be in compliance with the white cane law, would also be really helpful. So it might mean moving that stop line back a bit as well, to make sure there's a buffer between the pedestrian and the stopped car. Does that speak to what you're asking, or have I not fully understood your question?
Nope, I think you answered it. That it, in my case, is normally a solution of last resort in cases where, again, where design controls of the roadway are outside of the scope of the project. So we a lot of the times have to do the best that we can. So
exactly. Yep, exactly. So thank you so much for thinking about an alternative.
I don't see any more questions in the chat. I'm looking for hands. I don't see more hands up. Ryan's hand went up again. Go ahead, Ryan.
If nobody else has a question, I did want to address one thing towards what Denise was saying when she talked about others advocating when we see trip hazards and things of that nature. The ADA guidelines that she was speaking of also require that entities with 50 or more employees must both have an ADA coordinator assigned and an ADA transition plan. And those are required by law to have a specific grievance process. So one advocacy thing that we could be doing is verifying that where you live or where you frequent has that ADA transition plan, has a grievance process, has those things that they are required by law to do. And if they do, and you find something, to put that through the appropriate channels to advocate for those improvements.
Awesome. Thank you.
And it's a good reminder too that a lot of these particular engineering solutions aren't just because we want to be nice, it's because it's like required by law. And there's a good reason for that. Do we have any questions from the Facebook, from our people who are monitoring the Facebook? Oh, Mary Beth, I see you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So going back to the discussion around construction and maintaining access during construction. So I'm in Milwaukee. We do have a complete streets law that requires maintaining access, which rarely happens. Sometimes it's the city, it's the county, it's a private contractor. Any thoughts, advice on getting stakeholders to, live by that and start improving? Guys, I was really impressed by that image that you showed. I think it was from Madison, of an actual access maintained during construction.
It's so hard. It's the pain of it, and it's that constant vigilance. Every time I encounter inaccessibility during construction, I have to report it, and which is exhausting because there's always construction. And so the more that folks without disabilities also help be our allies and report it as well, then I often feel like I'm the lone voice, making the complaint. So that it would be huge for our allies to raise the awareness on it, and then as folks who oversee the projects, then actually having the initiative to do the fine or to do the warning letter to the contractor, and to hold them accountable. I've been really grateful when the city has said to the contractor, this has to be fixed by X time, and then I go and check on it, and there's the proper signage or barricades or whatever up by that time. And then I make the full circle and I contact the contractor and say thank you. I've often, in construction areas where I'm going to pass a lot, have asked for who's the site supervisor and have built a communication relationship with them so that when things change during construction, they notify me. So but the burden still heavily lays on the user who's impacted. Maribeth, thanks for that question. I don't have an easy solution.
That is a very good question. I myself live near a huge street construction project that is absolutely treacherous. I had to climb over a retaining wall to get somewhere the other day, and now I'm thinking about what steps I can take to try and fix that, because it's not going to be done anytime soon. I don't see more questions in the chat. And I don't see more hands up, so this is like last call. So I think, absent more questions, we will wrap things up. I want to give a big hand of applause and thank you to Denise and Cassie for sharing their expertise and their wisdom. Again, please, everyone, look for the link to this recording and all the links that will come out very soon after we are concluded here. Please visit the 1K Friends and Active Wisconsin websites and sign up for our e-news. There is a lot of more exciting stuff coming down the pike for Pedestrian Safety Month. There's some projects with AARP and some other things going on. So I think you will want to be looped into that. And with that, I will stop the recording and thank you all for attending. And I hope everyone has a great and safe week.